It was a blistering afternoon in a long-ago August, and I was on the phone with the president of the synagogue. In those first years, it was the late Ron Kriegsman, and he owned a pipe yard in the exurbs beyond Tulsa. I remember that it was a summer of periodic drought, and it was my first encounter with fire in the cornfields. I didn't think much at the time about climate change. Like everyone else, I put a brick in our toilet tank and imagined that I was doing my bit for the environment. But what Ron said that day was like an early alarm bell, some small sample of things to come. He could feel the fire advancing across the plains. He smelled the smoke, and he felt personally confronted. He was at the yard to see what would happen, but he didn't have a clue about whether he was safe. The fire would either devour the yard, or it would somehow burn itself out beforehand. And it was an even bet about what would happen next. I remember being struck by a sense of peril, strangely mixed with Ron's stoical acceptance. What was real to him was surreal to me, and I struggled to organize some version of a response. Finally, I suggested that he get into his car and flee. Ron calmly responded that he had another hour of paperwork. As they say in the climate biz, that was then. The time we should have devoted ourselves completely to the world that is now collapsing around us. All electric cars, carbon emissions, solar energies, wind farms in the panhandle. All of these things should now be in place as slime collects around those forgotten toilet bricks and our laughable attempts to put the planet in order. At the end of the day, a brick is a brick, and we needed massive, systemic, generational change. And I, for one, think about fire all the time. The turning point for me was British Petroleum and the explosion of oil and fire in the Gulf. 12 years later, it is still deeply embedded as a sign of the terrible damage we have wrought. The flaming platform was a kind of visual signature, like a skyscraper hauled out into the middle of the ocean, surrounded by pumpers trying to douse the flames. But it turned out that that was only the tip of the catastrophe. Great plumes of oil bubbled up from the seabed, flooding the water with goo and toxins. Imagine moray eels, 1,000 feet long, gasping their way to the fouled surface. Now, of course, it's fire on land, like the Dixie Fire in California. On the day I wrote these words in late August, the fire was still officially uncontained. As of this morning, the same is true. It is the second largest fire in California history and a perfect example of environmental collapse. The proximate cause was Pacific Gas and Electric and a line brought down by a falling tree. The real problem, though, is the combination of carelessness and drought. Carbon emissions raise the temperature of the planet. Rising temperatures mean less water on the ground, hotter weather, and bone-dry forests. One downed power line, and the earth explodes. The Dixie Fire has devoured nearly 1 million acres, an area that exceeds the size of New York City. 2 other fires have just broken out. A fire like this creates its own weather. It typically spawns terrifying phenomena. Tornadoes made of living flames, fires that jump from one ridge to another and seem immune to breaks like streets and highways. The city of Greenville is essentially gone, reduced to bent and blistered street signs. Once again, the video was terrifying. Instead of a hole in the middle of the Gulf, the Dixie Fire churned up smoke and ash like 4th of July snakes burning hot on the sidewalk, unnaturally thick and black and fast. I say this with a sense of personal investment. I am the Oklahoma Zadie of 2 California granddaughters. The Woolsey Fire of 2018 burned inside the city limits of Los Angeles and took down 1,000 permanent structures. On its fiercest day, it was barely a mile from the hallway leading to our granddaughters' bedrooms. Ruinous climate change is not an abstraction for me. It's an up-close and personal fact of my life. I realize that no one really wants to hear this. We are exactly 18 months into COVID, and there's no room in our heads for another big issue. It's like asking someone on September 12th to take up a new cause after September 11th. Even I, with endless bandwidth for disaster, have no more room for another catastrophe, let alone a catastrophe about the fate of the earth. The trouble is that there is simply no choice. Did you catch the news about the scary climate report this summer? The one that came from the UN? It said that things are exactly as bad as we think they are, and probably worse. In the next 20 years, average temperatures will rise, with all the attendant disastrous effects: coral reef collapse, mass extinctions, and killer heat waves like the ones last June. Island nations will disappear. All of this, plus the human garbage dump that used to be our green and beautiful planet. And it's not just about poor sea turtles and plastic. Many of us have children. Many of us have grandchildren. All of us know very young children who do not deserve to grow up in an inferno, unable to live in coastal communities because they long ago disappeared underwater. This is an issue that radiates existential terror, but it is also subject to the demands of our tradition that call out an insistent message of earth stewardship. We are not permitted to trash the planet. We are not permitted to destroy our home. I know that runs counter to the common view. Climate activists sometimes figure that we would be better off without people of faith like us. The problem is that we are still operating at a B- level. I think immediately of the first chapters of Genesis, which offer a vision of the world which is deeply problematic. The author loves the abundance of the world as he surveys the swarming miracle of creation, the bats and the pangolins, the snakes and the civet cats. But he also places it in a position of subservience. We are supposed to be fertile and increase and fill the earth and master it. All this goodness flows in our direction. Rulership and mastery are part of our eternal privilege. But before we get depressed about Genesis, I need to point out that this text is complicated. A planted tree belongs first to God, and only after a specified interval may its produce be harvested for human purpose. Exactly the same occurs in the cultivated landscape, where there is always a tithe that's being separated from the whole. I am not arguing that this is done for the benefit of the land, which would be the true test of an environmentally sensitive work. But eventually, the Torah reaches that level too, especially in the case of land management and of all things, war-making. I call you to remember the sabbatical year, the very year that begins today. When the Torah pauses to think about the landscape, it imagines a scheme of use and rest that extends the idea of Sabbath for human beings. Just as we cannot work ourselves and our livestock to the point where we struggle to recover from exhaustion, the same is true of the land that supports us. This theme of restraint is even better developed in the last book of the Torah. It's Deuteronomy, which addresses the issue of fruit trees and wartime. The rule is that such trees may not be chopped down in order to fashion siege works for war-making. No ladders, no scaffolds, no wooden battering rams. The Torah regards that as an impermissible loss. Warriors, after all, can fight. A tree is defenseless. And there are authorities who go way beyond this. In a very early rabbinic text, the tradition stops to think about the Messiah. It famously argues that if a person is planting a tree and suddenly hears that the Messiah has come, she should be careful not to run to greet him, but rather continue planting the tree. This is a beautiful conjunction of two crucial issues. First, the tradition is suspicious of excessive enthusiasm and sees it as a dangerous destabilizer. But second, it also sees the act of tree planting as fundamental in our hopes for a sustainable world. A Christian to greet the Messiah. Indeed, the tradition suggests that in the act of tree planting, the Messiah has already come for all of us. And that's the reason there is such a thing as the irreversible catastrophe. And it's now so close that we can feel its breath on our faces. And I don't want us to think that solutions will be easy, that we can fix the world with our own tiny hands. The brick in the toilet tank was a good idea. And at the beginning of the environmental movement, it was all we had. But it was a drop in the bucket. And it duped us into thinking stupid thoughts, that preventing climate change was a do-it-yourself deal. I don't mean to say that there is nothing we can do. The Synagogue takes climate change very seriously. We have morphed from a hopeless cluster of know-nothings to a savvy group of committed activists. A decade ago, when we began this process, we could barely fill a bucket of compost. Thanks to Corey Williams and her fiery activism, we are now in the forefront of monitoring energy usage and reducing our carbon footprint significantly. This very afternoon, we're reversing tashlich to pull things out of our waterways that don't belong there. We've positioned ourselves as model citizens, winning every award in Tulsa there is. Not to put too fine a point on things, but we are the only faith community in Tulsa that operates at the level of a corporate citizen. If we are going to do it, we wanted to do it seriously. But as many have noted, that is not enough. I read something else about climate change this summer, and it was a brilliant article by somebody named Emma Maris, aptly titled, "How to Stop Freaking Out." I felt that it had my name all over it. It was the middle of the summer, and I was freaking out. I've spent 18 months obsessing about COVID, and I felt that I had taken my eye off the climate ball. The world was collapsing because of me. Enter Maris with 5 things to do. I can do this, I said to Maris, and I'm determined to bring other people with me. Like every listicle, some of it was nonsense. Whenever people say that they've got 5 points to make, you know that at least 2 of them are simply pudding. But the other 3 were words to live by. Maris was the one who taught me about consumerism, that our personal habits are not to blame, and obsessing about them leads to dread and paralysis. I'm on board for that, and I have ditched my personal shame. Then she shared 2 essentials. The first was the useful command to go big. Environmental policy is what matters in the end. Policy, not person. Government action that favors wind farms, massive projects like seawalls made of oyster shells, insurance practices that discourage shore building, the demand that chain restaurants trade out beef for substitutes. We need to normalize good environmental practice by demanding the infrastructure for a sustainable future. The alternative will be grandchildren who live in the cesspool of our failure. The other thing she said was join with others. Eva Unterman has put her muscle behind the Sierra Club. I have just rejoined the National Resource Defense Council. One of the very best bets is Tulsa's own premier outfit, because you get to be part of an activist community. That would be Sustainable Tulsa. I know that it sounds so dull to write a check, but that's how things get done in this world. We cannot change the climate in our garages, putting on a show and crossing our fingers. We have to be smart and strategic and professional and organized, because there's really no time to lose. The Antarctic is home to many climate worries, but the one that people obsess about is called thwaites. You'll see it on a map in West Antarctica, and it beats the Dixie Fire by a mile. It's a glacier larger than the United Kingdom, and that's a whole lot of water locked up in a glacier. The problem is that it's coming apart. Water warmed by the effect of greenhouse gases is rapidly eating under the leading edge, which will eventually become a fragile shelf. When enough of the glacier is eaten away, it will detach from the continent and begin to drift, releasing all the water it has trapped for millennia. The result will be felt across the planet in a sea level rise of well over 2 feet, enough to drown every coastal city. We might be fine in Tulsa, but I hate to think about New York and Los Angeles and every other port in the whole wide world. Massive destruction, displacement, and doom. We would not likely survive the crush of refugees. I hate to worry you, but that's what I see. And the evidence of danger is vivid and ubiquitous. When I was a child in suburban Detroit, the world was alive with tiny creatures. Grasshoppers were everywhere. along with frogs and toads, most especially moths and butterflies. I didn't grow up on a farm in Michigan. It was a regular suburban neighborhood in Detroit, one neighborhood north of Eminem's 8 Mile. I love my beautiful neighborhood in Tulsa, but I don't see any of these creatures anymore. I haven't seen a wild frog in years, and I have never seen a grasshopper on the lawn outside my door. Our granddaughter Lucy doesn't know about fireflies. I'm assuming that they have all been trashed by herbicides and that we are already living in the silent spring. But it's the absence of butterflies that hurts the most. Every so often I'll see a single monarch or some nondescript butterfly that barely merits the name. They were one of the delights of my suburban childhood. Clouds of butterflies in open fields, but they have disappeared out of city skies. To appropriate a phrase from another context, butterflies don't live here, at least not in Tulsa, because we have been asleep. And it's now time to awaken. No sermon is enough, no virtuous thought, no letter to the editor, and no brick in a toilet tank. We need to do this together. We need to use our power. We need systemic change on the grandest scale, driven relentlessly by public outrage. I call upon myself and I call upon you. We are already living in a dying world, and no one can bring it to life except us. Amen.